Welcome to the debate. So when you first walk onto a commercial construction site, right before the drywall goes up and all the finishes are applied, there's a profound sense of truth to the space.
Oh, absolutely. You can smell the curing concrete.
Right.
You see the raw steel I-beams, the exposed ductwork, just mapping out the whole mechanical logic of the HVAC system. You see the heavy load-bearing columns.
It's naked architecture, basically. Unapologetic and completely exposed.
Exactly. It is pure structural reality. You look at one of those steel columns, and it isn't trying to be anything other than what it physically is. It's just transferring a load straight down into the foundation.
Yeah, it's doing work.
Right, it's doing work, and its form is a direct manifestation of that work. It is, for lack of a better word, honest. But then, the construction schedule moves forward. We frame around it, we clad it, we wrap that honest steel column in polished marble or wood veneer so it stops looking like a raw feat of engineering and starts looking like, a bank.
Yeah.
We dress the building up to communicate a very specific message to the public.
Which introduces the exact intellectual friction we are exploring today. For the architecture students joining us, we are looking directly at the foundation of modernist architectural pedagogy, a concept that's been drilled into your head since your very first studio critique.
Ah, yes. Louis Sullivan's famous 1896 maxim.
You know it well. Form follows function. And I will be arguing from Sullivan's perspective today, maintaining that true architectural form must be an honest organic derivation of a structure's physical purpose.
And I will be examining a radically different counter-perspective from our source material, the essay From Sullivan to Krippendorff, Does Form Follow Function or Meaning? I'll be focusing on Klaus Krippendorff's concept of product semantics, which argues that form doesn't actually follow function at all. It follows meaning.
A bold claim.
I know, but I will argue that any form, even the most supposedly pure, functional, exposed steel beam you love so much, is fundamentally a text meant to be read and understood by the user. Design is, at its core, a communicative act.
Well, to really grasp the gravity of Sullivan's argument, we have to look at the technological earthquake of 1896. The advent of the steel skeleton framework just completely upended centuries of structural logic.
Right, because before that, if you wanted height, you needed massive, thick masonry walls at the base just to support the vertical load.
Exactly. Suddenly you had this rigid steel frame taking all the loads, and you could build 20 stories high with non-load-bearing curtain walls.
The rules of gravity were suddenly handled completely differently.
Right. And what did architects initially do with this unprecedented technology?
They panicked. They disguised it.
They absolutely did. They took these soaring steel structures and dressed them up to look like stacked Greek temples or, stretched out Renaissance palazzos. And Sullivan looked at this and saw a fundamental betrayal.
Because the visual language of the past was actively contradicting the engineering reality of the present.
Precisely. Him masking a lightweight steel frame in heavy, faux load-bearing classical masonry was essentially lying to the public. It would be like, building a digital smartwatch, but painting fake, immovable, mechanical gears onto the glass. It's a structural deception.
Yeah, I see that.
Sullivan argued that a tall building must honestly express its soaring vertical inner skeleton. And he wasn't just offering a trendy design rule here. He framed this as an inescapable law of nature.
Right, in the tall office building artistically considered.
Exactly. He points out that in all organic and inorganic things, form springs from the work it does, like the sweeping aerodynamic curve of an eagle's wing or the geometric unfolding of a flower petal to catch sunlight. They don't look that way for arbitrary decorative reasons. Their form is the inevitable biological result of their function.
Which sounds entirely unassailable, honestly, until you realize that a building's function isn't just about resisting gravity or sheltering from the rain.
What do you mean?
Well, what happens when the physical function of a building is met, but the human mind completely fails to interpret it? That is where Krippendorff steps in. Let's look at the semantic turn he introduced in the 1980s. Krippendorff boiled his philosophy down to a very different maxim. Design is making sense of things.
Making sense rather than making function.
Yes, because Krippendorff recognizes a fundamental cognitive reality. When a human being encounters a building or a space, they do not mathematically calculate its physical function. They try to read it.
They rely on past experiences.
Right. They rely on cognitive schemas built from cultural conditioning and physiological cues to figure out what a thing is and how they are supposed to interact with it. Functionality, strictly speaking, is just a physical event inside a system.
Sure.
Like a lock mechanism turning is a physical function, but making that function visible, intuitive, and comprehensible to a human brain before they even touch the lock, that is entirely a matter of meaning.
So you're separating the mechanical action from the psychological anticipation of that action.
Exactly. Meaning is not mere decoration applied after the fact. Meaning is the very cognitive mechanism that enables use. If you strip away meaning in the pursuit of pure mechanical function, the object just becomes unusable.
Okay, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. That assumes Sullivan was advocating for the removal of all communication, which is a total misreading of his work.
Is it, though?
It is. Let's look at the morality of design, specifically the whole debate around ornament. What Sullivan was fighting against, and what I still see as the inherent risk in Krippendorff's prioritization of meaning, is the trap of arbitrary styling.
Okay, go on.
When Sullivan demanded that we strip away superficial, glued-on historical ornamentation, he was making an ethical argument for architectural honesty, but we must be precise here. Sullivan was not anti-ornament.
No, I mean, his own buildings are famous for it. The Guarantee Building is practically draped in terracotta detailing.
But let's look at how that terracotta operates. It is not pasted on to look like a Roman arch. At the base of the Guarantee Building, where humans actually interact with the storefronts, the ornament is highly tactile and detailed.
Right. It scales to the human body.
Exactly. But as the building rises, the terracotta patterns trace the vertical structural piers, explicitly drawing the eye upward to emphasize the uninterrupted structural ascent. The ornament grows intrinsically out of the building's internal logic.
It highlights the structure.
It makes the invisible forces of the building visible. When we expose the raw function of a space, or when our detailing honestly reflects the load paths, we are presenting an objective truth to the user. We are removing deception. That isn't a stylistic choice, it is a commitment to the physical reality of the built environment.
I come at it from a different way, actually. Because that right there is the crux of where Krippendorff's theory just dismantles the modernist mythology. I would argue that stripping away historical ornament or exposing raw structure does not actually return a building to some state of objective zero-degree truth.
Of course it does.
No, it simply creates a new, highly specific meaning.
How is exposing what is physically there anything other than objective truth?
Because you are still curating an aesthetic experience to broadcast a message. Think about the studio students listening. When a student designs a completely bare, minimalist, poured-in-place concrete wall and leaves those little round form tie holes exposed.
A classic studio move.
Very classic. But that wall does not lack meaning. It is actively screaming a message at the viewer. It communicates honesty, yes, but it also communicates simplicity, engineering logic, and adherence to modernism, and a very deliberate rejection of bourgeois historical styles.
It is communicating its material reality.
But to achieve that so-called raw look requires immense hidden labor. The architect has to specify the exact grain of the formwork boards. They have to vibrate the concrete perfectly to avoid honeycombing.
Well, yes, craftsmanship matters.
And they have to hide the mechanical conduit somewhere else entirely so the wall looks pure. The functional simplicity that modernists idolize is actually one of the most powerful, highly orchestrated stylistic choices an architect can make, precisely because it pretends not to be a style.
That's a cynical cake.
It disguises its meaning as objective truth. You are still decorating the building, you're just decorating it with the costume of functionality.
Okay, you're relying on a massive assumption there, which is that architectural elements only exist to be interpreted. Let me offer an analogy here.
Go for it.
When we detail a structural steel connection in the studio, we are solving a physics problem of load transfer, shear forces, and moment frames. We are not writing a poem.
I never said you were writing poetry.
No, but let's ground this in the hard reality of what architecture actually does. Unlike a graphic designer, an architect manipulates mass, gravity, weather, and thermodynamics. If a cantilever is under-engineered, it collapses.
Obviously.
Gravity does not care about the user's cultural context or their semiotic interpretation of the steel. The building stands or falls based on objective, mathematically provable function. Doesn't Krippendorff's focus on cultural meaning just completely ignore the hard physics of architecture?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Of course, gravity is objective. No one is arguing that a building doesn't have to stand up. But your definition of failure is way too narrow.
Structural collapse is the ultimate failure.
Physically, yes. But a building can solve the physics problem perfectly, remain structurally flawless for a century, and still completely fail as a piece of architecture if its users cannot cognitively navigate it.
Give me an example.
Consider a large, modern hospital. The concrete shear walls are robust, the structural bays are perfectly proportioned, the HVAC systems work flawlessly. But if a frantic family member cannot intuitively figure out how to get from the emergency entrance to the ICU, because the forms of the corridors, the lighting, and the spatial thresholds don't clearly communicate their purpose, the architecture has failed.
But that's a failure of signage or perhaps circulation planning. It doesn't negate the necessity of honest structural form.
It is absolutely a failure of form. If the architectural form itself doesn't afford wayfinding, it fails. This requires what Krippendorff called second-order understanding.
Okay, unpack that.
The architect can't just understand the physics of the building. They have to actively model the user's mental model. When an architect designs a door, they must understand how the user thinks about doors. Take the classic Norman door problem.
Oh, sure.
If a glass door requires you to pull, but the architect has attached a flat metal plate to it, the visual cue communicates push. The structural hinges work perfectly. The physical function is intact. But because the meaning broadcast by the flat plate contradicts the physical function, the user slams their face into the glass.
Right, a frustrating experience.
The functionality is rendered entirely useless because the meaning was incorrect.
That is a compelling microexample, but you are actually reinforcing Sullivan's argument without realizing it.
How so?
Think about it. If a door needs to be pulled, but it is equipped with a plate that visually suggests pushing, that form is not honestly expressing its function. It is a deceptive form. Sullivan would reject that door just as forcefully as Krippendorff would, precisely because the form is lying about the work it does.
But the mechanism of why it fails is cognitive, not mechanical. And that brings us to the most brilliant synthesis in the source material. Sullivan himself was dealing in pure semantics when he formulated his famous rule.
I highly doubt Sullivan saw himself as a semanticist.
Look at the language he uses in that 1896 text. He states he wants the skyscraper to look like a tall, proud, soaring thing. He wants the exterior form to reveal its inner truth. The operative words there are look and reveal.
Yes, he wanted the outside to accurately reflect the inside.
Exactly. And accurately reflecting something to an observer is fundamentally a communication task. Therefore, form follows function is really just a specialized subset of form follows meaning.
Wait, really? A subset?
Yes. It is simply the specific scenario where the designer consciously chooses honest functionality as the semantic message they want to broadcast to the world. Sullivan was working entirely within Krippendorff's domain of meaning-making. He just limited his vocabulary to the language of structural mechanics.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. Because blurring those lines is incredibly dangerous for an architect. Intent matters immensely here.
Why is it dangerous?
When you argue that form follows function is just a subset of semantics, you risk unmooring architecture from its physical responsibilities. Sullivan's intent is anchored in the material reality of the object. He is trying to close the gap between what a thing physically is and what it visually looks like.
Whereas you believe product semantics widens that gap?
If taken to its logical extreme, absolutely. I mean, if form only follows the meaning we want to project, and structural honesty is just one of many optional styles, then what stops us from descending into pure theatricality?
Well, you still have to solve the physics problem.
But it leads to the exact trap of postmodernism in the 1980s, or, Robert Venturi's concept of the decorated shed. If the building is just a structurally sound box, and our only job as designers is to apply whatever semantic meaning we want onto the facade to communicate with the user, architecture ceases to be architecture.
It becomes a billboard.
Exactly, it becomes a billboard. We end up right back in 1896, pasting fake Greek columns onto steel skyscrapers simply because that's the meaning the user associates with a bank. By anchoring form strictly to physical function, Sullivan keeps architecture tethered to truth rather than letting it drift into pure scenography.
But the user lives in a world of scenography. You cannot design spaces for human beings without acknowledging human psychology and cultural memory. Yes, the risk of pure semantics is pastiche, just slapping historical symbols onto boxes.
Which we both agree is awful.
Right. But the reward of semantic design, when done rigorously, is deep legibility. It's a building that welcomes you, that intuitively guides your body through a sequence of spaces, that resonates with your cultural context. We cannot escape this.
Even if we try.
Exactly. Every architectural form you draft carries meaning, whether you intend it to or not. A blank wall means something. A glass mullion means something. The question isn't whether form should follow function or meaning. The question is whether the meaning your building projects is chosen intentionally by you or just left to accident.
And perhaps that is where we find a critical convergence for the students evaluating their own design processes today.
I think so.
Because what Sullivan's mandate provides is an indispensable physical foundation for any architect. Designing from the inside out, letting the inner programmatic and structural reality dictate the outer form, keeps your architecture grounded in the forces of nature.
It stops you from just making things up.
Right. It prevents you from resorting to arbitrary, tacked-on shapes just because they look interesting in a rendering. A building must first possess internal organic logic.
And I wholeheartedly agree that arbitrary design is the enemy. Where Krippendorff expands on Sullivan's foundation is by reminding us that buildings are ultimately inhabited by human beings, and humans are meaning-making creatures.
They certainly are.
Recognizing that your structural logic will instantly be read as a text by anyone walking past it actually empowers you as a designer. It allows you to be deeply intentional about what that exposed shear wall or that cantilevered canopy is actually communicating to the nervous system of the user.
So whether you rely on internal organic logic, as Sullivan dictated, or prioritize semantic legibility, as Krippendorff demands, the mandate for the architect remains remarkably rigorous. Every single element of your design, down to the hardware on the door, must be deeply intentional and thoroughly justified.
So, for those of you working in studio right now, we challenge you to interrogate your current projects. Look at the massing models, the circulation paths, the structural bays you are laying out.
Ask yourselves, are the forms you are drafting truly following function? Are they honestly and efficiently expressing the physical work they are doing?
Or are they following meaning? Are you utilizing a specific aesthetic, even a stark, raw, minimalist one, to communicate a highly curated message to your user?
Or, as our debate today suggests, are those two concepts ultimately impossible to untangle in the human mind?
It is a theoretical tension that will govern every line you draw for the rest of your career.
Because the next time you walk onto that raw commercial construction site and you look up at that heavy, exposed steel I-beam waiting for its final cladding, you have to ask yourself, is its profound honesty found purely in the mathematical load it carries or in the story it tells you about how it carries it?